Thank you very much. I joked as I came in here, this is the kind of room where you could kind of refound the European Union or solve the climate change crisis with a new agreement. There's something about this room that's very formal. I feel as I'm kind of, whoa. And there's a crowd up there. Holy smoke, hello up there. It's very nice to be here. There's some friends in the room. There's some representatives of a perfect country, Canada, in the room. I walked in and this is a tough crowd, I walked in and one of your most distinguished colleagues plumped down a talk on the paper on my topic saying this is what you ought to be saying. So I can't win, folks, but I'm going to try, anyway. I want to talk to you about the authoritarian turn. I want to start with some thoughts that start with Karl Popper, Open Society and Its Enemies, 1945. Engage with the problematic of, should we think of the world we're in now as a contrast between open and closed societies? I'll argue no. I'll argue that open and closed isn't the right metaphor. Why? Because I think there's a new kind of authoritarian society that is distinctively open to the world, and that is what is so fascinating. We're assisting and living through the emergence of a new type of single-party regime that is uniquely open to the world in ways that give it forms of stability that were not available to more authoritarian, totalitarian, and closed societies of the past. In fact, my central theme is really about the collusion, the uneasy, corrupting influence that is emerging between genuinely open societies, the classical liberal constitutional type, and these new single-party regimes. So that's the menu, and I will try and get through this so that we have lots of time for you to tell me just how wrong I am. Just to start with Popper, he starts with a contrast between an open society and closed societies. It's 1945. The closed societies are clearly defined as Soviet totalitarianism, then in ascendant, Nazi Germany, then heading to catastrophic defeat. An open society is distinctive as a model of freedom because Popper was a philosopher of science, so it connects an idea of democracy to an idea of scientific falsification, the testing and rejection of truth. And whatever else is wrong with Popper, what's great about Popper is that it's the strongest epistemology of freedom that I think we have in the definitions of liberal democracy since the Second World War. And as you know, after 1989, and partly because of the promotional efforts of George Soros and many other people, open society became a slogan, a battle cry, and a model for the transition from closed societies to open societies, and that in a single slogan was what was supposed to happen after 1989. To go from closed to open was what a transition in Central and Eastern Europe and throughout the former Soviet Empire was supposed to be. And hey, presto, in 2018, we're in a very different world where the transition has not gone from closed societies, but to a new form of single-party state that in Central and Eastern Europe is anti-communist, yet Bolshevik in its fundamental political culture. That's crony capitalist in economic form, that is anti-pluralist in its cultural form, that is reluctantly European in foreign policy, and in judicial matters, and this is crucial, and I know there's some very distinguished Poles in the room, so I'm going to get Poland wrong. Let me confess right away, I'm going to get Poland wrong. I want the Poles to correct me. But I think there's use in seeing that instead of an open society is characterized by the rule of law, and in a lot of these single-party states we're transiting to what could be called rule by law, and the difference is fundamental. certainly characteristic in Hungary. And so in the transitions in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Russia, also in China, the perfection of the single-party state. They're not all the same thing. They have distinct national characteristics. I don't want to slur those national characteristics, but there's a family resemblance in the single-party state that I think we need to think about. I will say much less about the inroads of the authoritarian right are making in Western liberal democracies. That's in a sense a separate question. We can happy to talk about it. The issue there is we've always had a constitutional conservatism in European politics, and it's worth resembling. I'm an old liberal, but you know, the post-war Western welfare state was built by Christian conservatives, by Christian Democrats, by Franz Joseph Strauss, by Alcide de Gasperi. That kind of constitutional conservatism is one of the things that built Europe and built the European Union. And now we seem to have a conservatism, a Christian conservatism, which is at the edge of constitutional propriety. And that may be when Viktor Orban says, I'm going to build a Christian democracy in my country, it sounds like Franz Joseph Strauss and Alcide de Gasperi, but let me tell you, it bears no resemblance to that distinguished, authentic conservative tradition in European thought. So I have questions about this transition to the single-party state. Why did it happen? Secondly, is the phenomenon contingent or reversible? That is, are these stable, long-term political formations? And if the latter, what are the implications for a European project? I mean, I'm going to do very big picture, and big picture always gets you into trouble with extremely skilled postdoctoral and tenured academics, but hell, somebody's got to do this, and you can all shoot it all down. But if I get up at 35,000 feet and ask why this astonishing transition, instead of the transition to open society, we've got transition to the single-party state, and we ask why it's happening, I think we have to start with a crisis very close to home, the crisis of open society and functioning Western liberal democracies. I think there are three events that have simply transformed politics since the turn of the 21st century. They're pretty obvious. One of them has been 9/11, the global terrorist spectacular. The second one has been the economic crisis of 2008. And the third has been the migration surge since 2015. Those three events have simply put liberal democratic models under enormous strain. These crises have been managed, but they have not been surmounted. They've created enormous political space to the center-right within Western liberal democracies, and they have helped to propel the Eastern democracies away from liberal constitutionalism towards increasingly authoritarian forms of politics. And they're saying, these single-party regimes are saying, your open society, liberal democratic, liberal constitutional models have failed in the face of these three challenges, and we are the alternative. And certainly these events have falsified a liberal democratic narrative to which I was as prey as anyone else, which was the sense that history was moving from closed to open, from autarkic to globalized, from authoritarian to democratic. We should have known or should have remembered Alexander Herzen's immortal line repeated so often by Isaiah Berlin, history has no libretto. You know, history is not the song of liberty. But you forget it in moments of euphoria. It was natural to forget it, but the old 19th century geniuses had a firmer sense that history serves no master, history serves no happy narrative, and I think liberal constitutionalists like me were susceptible to a certain kind of narrative capture from which we are being reluctantly awakened, and that seems a good thing, really. These three events, 9/11, 2008, and 2015, raised two questions for ordinary citizens in Western democracies and Central and Eastern Europe alike, which is, who's to blame? And the second one, who will protect me now? Who will protect me now is a fundamental question in politics, always and at all times, especially when crisis starts. So the first question, and who is to blame is always a foundational question in politics. Who is to blame for terrorism? The narration from the right, the alt-right, and the anti-constitutional right came quickly. Who is to blame for terrorism? It was foreigners without, global Islam, foreigners within. There are, I hope, in this room, Muslim believers, our friends, our comrades, our fellow brothers and sisters. It's been very, very tough to be a Muslim believer in the weight of this onslaught. The criminalization of a religion is one of the most unfortunate political consequences of the last 20 years, one of the most tragic, one before which I think the liberal friends of pluralism have not responded adequately. But it's had the effect, I think, of a re-questioning at the heart of liberal democratic societies, of open society as a pact of multicultural trust. We have surmounted the terrorist challenge as a security threat. These societies cannot tip the wagon of liberal constitutionalism over. They have done damage to the liberal constitutional order. We all feel we're in a much more securitized state than we were in 2000, but these things are not going to overthrow liberal constitutional orders. But they have had a devastating effect on the tacit, very successfully reproduced trust that from the opening of global migration flows from the mid-60s onwards, we walked ourselves backward into a multicultural society sustained by a molecular practice of trust that I've looked at in the ordinary virtues. And that pact of trust is under tremendous strain. This is what the terrorist spectacular is trying to destroy. It can't destroy the constitutional order of these societies, but it sure can pulverize our politics and destroy the trust on which multi-ethnic, cross-ethnic, cross-religious political mobilization occurs. It's had a second effect in terms of opening the question, does open society mean open borders? Of course, open society doesn't mean open borders. You can't have any kind of society at all or any kind of political order unless you have border control. Even a perfect society like Canada has border control, and it's paradoxically the very condition of such generosity as we have towards refugee and migrant populations. But the question of the association between open society and open borders is opened as never before. That's the impact of the first crisis, the crisis of terrorism. The impact of the second crisis, the 2008 crisis, when you then ask who is held to blame for this crisis since 2008, you get kind of three guilty parties and the guilty parties are named to the left and they're named to the right. There's a convergence from both sides of the political spectrum to blame the globalized financial elites who sold us dodgy mortgages and flipped companies and benefited while our wages stagnated. So the global financial elites are taking a hit. The interesting hit that I notice everywhere I go is that the cosmopolitan knowledge elites, i.e. us folks, have taken a tremendous whacking since 2008. There's a room full of economists. Why the hell didn't you tell us the the lights were flashing red. What the hell is this social science for if you can't predict a global economic meltdown? You tell us that there is a thing called a science of society. You tell us the whole point of your knowledge is to predict, prevent, and serve your societies. Where the hell were you in 2007, 2008? I think that's a question that has spread to the left of the spectrum and spread to the right and produced these very interesting effects in the Brexit referendum in 2011 when a highly literate, very sophisticated conservative politician could actually say and strike a huge chord with the electorate, we've had enough of experts. This is picking up something that everybody in this room needs to think about a little bit. And I think it comes back to the predictive failures of social science in 2007, 2008. The third area the third entity that has taken blame for the financial crisis of 2008 has been the liberal regulatory state. The economic crisis of 2008 lay bare the extraordinary weakness of the regulatory capacity of the neoliberal state. I hate the word neoliberal, but I don't know what the heck else to call it. It's not the liberalism that I knew in the 60s, the Mike Pearson liberalism, the liberalism of the strong Rooseveltian state. It's the state that we got after Thatcher and Reagan had gone to work and told us, and the electorate for 25 years, that government was the problem, not the solution. Well, you end up in 2008 with all the lights flashing red. You've taken down the regulatory frameworks for the financial system. You've got a liberal regulatory state that's helpless, but the consequence is borne by liberals. That is, our faith in the state, our belief that the state can predict, prevent, react in time, took enormous damage for the 25, 30 years of deregulation that weakened the capacity of the state to prevent and protect. And so it empowered a conservative counter-revolution that, despite the economic chaos since 2008, persists in winning an electorate by saying the state is the problem, not the solution. The economic crisis also laid bare an inequality problem that I think liberal constitutionalists like me had seen coming and not done enough at all to confront: rising income shares for a credentialed minority versus wage stagnation for those without credentials. And again, and for the second time in what I'm saying, universities are back at the start. We've been saying for 60 years we're part of the solution. After 2008, a lot of people saying our role in credentialing inequality is part of the problem. It's just something we need to think about. Our line back, which is opportunity, opportunity, mobility, access, 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 it's not working politically. We are still regarded as an institution that is part of the problem, not part of the problem, part of the solution. This inequality has broken apart the political consensus that sustained the welfare state. It's eroded support for centrist liberal social democracy, and it's also eroded support for universities. And in this climate, this triple crisis of terrorism, economic crisis, and the migration surge of 2015, the migration surge of 2015 flowed through the railway stations of Munich, Vienna, and Budapest. And I think we remember the extraordinary outpouring of generosity that migratory surge triggered. I remember being in Munich station just after the crisis and talking to the police, and the police were very interesting. They said, we've got a Twitter feed in Munich, at the Munich police station, and during the height of the crisis, every time we sent a Twitter note to the Munich public Remember, this is Bavaria. Remember, this is CSU country. Remember how conservative this part of Europe is. Every time we sent out a Twitter feed saying, we've run out of blankets, we've run out of water, we've run out of mattresses, in 20 minutes, the Munich population flooded the forecourts of Munich station with support. What is then so interesting is the way that generosity, that impulse of generosity and solidarity with human beings in distress was then systematically confiscated by our political systems. So that 2 years later, to express solidarity and generosity towards refugees and migrants is to betray Germany, to betray Hungary, to betray. We need to think much more deeply about the ways in which political discourse and political rhetoric is always working to control, shape, mold, and confiscate emotions, take emotions off the table so they cannot even be expressed, nay, even felt. So that in 2018, it is axiomatic for most people I go to outside of Hungary to say, what the hell happened to Hungary? Why are you guys so incredibly hostile to migrants? Well, what happened was 3 years of systematic discourse in which to be generous to a stranger was reconstituted by a political order into an act of betrayal to the Hungarian nation, right? You take 3 years of that, and you can do a lot of harm to people's basic instincts of solidarity and decency. And if you think it can't happen in your countries, think again. Because that's one of the messages of the Hungarian story that is most morally upsetting to me as an old liberal. Because I've married one. I've lived in this country on and off for 25 years. The way Hungary now thinks about its emotional relations to others has been transformed by the ideological system of a single-party state. And then the only question in politics becomes, if they are the threat, if they are the menace, if they are the hostile others, if generosity to them is betrayal, then the only question in politics is, who will protect me now? You set the table with this. You work people's emotion, then you set the table for the only question, which is, who will protect me now? And the answer, again, it's a challenge to liberals and people on the progressive left, is the answer to who will protect me now could have come from the left. It could have come from the progressive center. It actually came from the constitutional and anti-constitutional right. And we're in the middle of a full-blown conservative counter-revolution that is resentment-driven, authoritarian, anti-liberal, nationalist, and majoritarian populist. And the psychological drivers of this are fear and greed. And to say that fear is the driver here is not to dismiss the fears, not to dismiss the fears that are triggered by migration, and they're intense in Italy. Not to bat them aside and say, come to your senses, dear citizens. That seems like a mistake. Take those fears seriously, but they've been deeply manipulated. They've been deeply structured by a political discourse over 3 years. The fears are a future without jobs, a fear of the loss of identity, a fear of the loss of national cohesion, fears of downward mobility. These fears are, the one thing I learned about politics is that emotions are facts in politics. The idea that you can sit there and say, I'm sorry, you've got the wrong emotions, is a ticket to defeat. Let me tell you, I know something about that. These fears are real, need to be taken for what they are, taken seriously, engaged with, discussed, met. In America, the particular feature is that the identity loss has a particular form, which is the fear of the passing of imperial hegemony. You simply can't make any sense of the fears that drove Donald Trump to office unless you see them as fear of America's loss of imperial hegemony in the world and the rise of China. And that then pulls all the fears into one slogan, which is make America great. To make America great again is to answer the question, who will protect me now? America will protect me now. I've talked a little bit about fear. What about greed? I think it's extremely important to notice that the consolidation of single-party states is a drive to secure and distribute rents. The consolidation of national conservative single-party states is designed to consolidate a national bourgeoisie that is dependent for its rents on access to state power through a single party. And this seems to me a tremendous driver of what's going on. And one of your colleagues, Dorothée Bolle, has taught me a lot about that, as has Bela Grešković. So I get a lot of this from the great people at EUI Florence, and they know more about it than I do, but I want to pay public debt to their scholarship. Let me say just a few words about Hungary, because it's such an interesting elucidation of some of these issues, because there the question is, why does a liberal transition from communism turn illiberal? Why do you not go from closed society to open society, but to single-party regime? It's a puzzle, needless to say, as everybody knows, because Viktor Orban begins as one of the heroes of the liberal transition. Recipient of a Soros scholarship, one of the more ironic acts of generosity in the post-war period. And again, what seems to happen is that the liberal transition privatizes the economy, delivers Hungary into the EU, creates the constitutional order of a liberal democracy, and crucially, empowers a new liberal middle class. And CEU is founded, in a sense, to empower and train that new liberal transition elite. And we succeeded. We got 14,000 graduates around the world, and we did a great job. The problem is we trained the elite that lost, right? While we were training the elite that dominated Hungarian politics from, say, 1991 through till 2010, a new elite was taking shape, as Bela Grešković and others have shown. It was a counter-elite, a small-town, national, socially conservative elite, not Budapest-based, that resented the liberal ascendancy, that resented the cosmopolitanism, resented its credentials, its university credentials, and resented, this is a crucial point, its growing corruption. The liberal transition elite began to feed at the trough, did pretty well. And the counter-elite, conservative, religious, small town, saw in Fidesz a machine that would bring it to power. Fidesz then capitalizes on the political bankruptcy of the transition elite, which is broken apart precisely by the economic crisis of 2008. They can't handle it. The cupboard is bare. The country is essentially bankrupt. And in the chaos of failing to master that second crisis, the crisis of 2008, Orban comes to power. He captures state power. He empowers a new elite that is dependent on rent-seeking, a highly nationalist economic policy, and on the benefits to be gained from institutional capture. And here there's another very interesting part of this story, which we need to say in a European institution like this. The transition to illiberal democracy and authoritarian single-party rule is enormously enabled and assisted by EU structural subsidy. 4 billion euros pour into this economy after 2010, and it's then distributed in rents to a conservative national elite. And so the European Union has been an enormous enabler of this process in ways that we need to understand. The party state has now moved to control the media, to gerrymander the electoral system, to control the courts, and to bring an independent university like CEU to heel or force it out of the country. I think one of the aspects of this story that is so interesting, I'm not trying to depress you. I just find the whole thing so interesting. And it being interesting is important because we can't overcome this. We can't get this right unless we go to the bottom of what's going on. Because the thing that I find so interesting is the ways in which the language of democracy is turned against democracy itself. In Poland, in Hungary, but also in Turkey, democratic mandates are used to limit democracy. You have a majoritarian language of democracy turned systematically against the liberal constitutional view of democracy. That is, democracy is not simply majority rule, it's majority rule balanced by minority rights, a free press, an independent judiciary. And this majoritarian language has been enormously successful in delegitimizing those elites, the press, the university professors, and the judges, who are then recast not as defenders of liberal constitutionalism, but as the rent-seeking manipulators of an institutional order that is hostile to the will of the people. It's really clever stuff. It's actually extremely sophisticated. It turns a majoritarian language of democracy against liberal constitutionalism and has had enormous success. Some of the same impulses, a majoritarian language of democracy turned against democracy itself, are evident in the oldest parliamentary democracy of all, in Brexit. All of you will remember the astounding headline in the Daily Mail when judges said, well, you really ought to consult Parliament. And the judges in the oldest parliamentary democracy in the world are called the enemies of the people in a mass circulation daily. And you think, wow, as a Canadian, as a child of this liberal parliamentary system, I felt a real physical shock reading that. I mean, it's a horrible newspaper. Everybody knows it's horrible. But this is an argument. That's the point. It's an argument. Judges are corrupt, entitled, empowered, distorters of the majority will of the people, just as those professors and experts are manipulating academic freedom to reproduce liberal political correctness. The will of the people is thwarted. This stuff is powerful, important. It needs to be understood, but it needs to be understood as a language of democracy turned against itself. Now, let me get to so that's kind of my high-level account of why some of these things are happening and some of the salient features we need to think about. But I now want to turn to the second question, which is, are these new single-party states durable, or whether they're a passing phenomenon? And I want to use one of the saints. I've said some critical things about social science, but God Almighty, there's some wonderful people in social science, and I think everybody in the room would say that Albert Hirschman was one of the giants. And the book that's had an enormous, ongoing, lifelong impact on me is needless to say, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And I wanted to use Exit, Voice, and Loyalty to talk about whether these single-party states are durable. And I think if you look at Exit, these new single-party states all allow exit. It's extremely important stabilizer for the regime. If you don't like Hungary, you can go and work as a waiter in Dusseldorf or Florence. If you don't like Poland, you can go to Scunthorpe, and they do. If you don't like Russia, you can offshore your ill-gotten gains in a bank in London. Turkey the same, China the same. Anybody in Vancouver knows that if you're a little unhappy about China and you want to hedge your bets, you put your kids into the University of British Columbia and you buy a condo on the shore in Vancouver. This is not like the totalitarian regimes of the 1945 to 1989. They were building autarky, A-U-T-A-R-K-Y, within a socialist system that was closed. These regimes allow exit in ways that are crucial to their stabilization. They allow the discontented to exit, and they have another effect economically, which is that if you've abolished rule of law in a single-party state, as many of them do, then the first thing one of your new dependent national bourgeoisie asks, because they're not stupid, is, are my assets safe here? In a rule-by-law state where it really is the will of the ruler that determines whether I can hold on to my property and my assets, the answer is, your assets are not very safe in a rule-by-law state, so let's find a rule-of-law state where you've got rights of appeal. Bingo, London. Bingo, the judicial system. Bingo, their wonderful banking system. Bingo, the laundromat of money that works 24/7 in the city. I don't have, by the way, an anti-capitalist bone in my body. I'm just saying we have to understand what's going on. And the crucial thing are the lawyers in London. The ways in which they find vehicles that make sure that the people who could potentially threaten Putin, who could potentially threaten these regimes, know that they've got a safe place to put their money and their kids. And that then stabilizes the regimes back home. And this illuminates a certain kind of collusion in how these liberal democratic constitutional orders collude and empower the single-party state. In some sense, it's the key message I want us to think about. I haven't figured all this out. I'm not an expert, but there's something going on here that is enormously important. So that's something about exit. The other issue is voice. If you walk around Budapest, you can say anything you want. The cops aren't listening to you. There is not, to my knowledge, a secret police state. Nobody's sitting in the corner of the cafe listening to make sure that you've said a subversive word. It's not Kadar. It's Orban. You can say anything you want in Hungary. Nobody's listening. The media have been collapsed. The media have been deprived of the supports that they need in order to survive. So the free media has collapsed. There is a social media presence. You can say anything you want. It actually enables the regimes, this is also true in China, to hear just how public opinion is going. These regimes are very, very sensitive to public opinion, and that's precisely why they allow voice, so that they can hear and anticipate problems before they are. As for loyalty, and so finally, the final point about voice is that self-censorship rather than party censorship becomes the moral dilemma inside these societies. The voice dies in your own throat. You don't go to jail, you just think it's not worth saying anymore. Loyalty, the third axis of the Hirschman trilogy, is important because in the old days, in the totalitarian regimes of the Nazi past, the communist past, these regimes insisted on loyalty to the party and loyalty to the state. And now this is where nationalism comes in. These regimes are clever enough to deflect loyalty away from the regime, away from the state, to the nation. And then they make the state and the party the voice of the nation, the articulation of the nation. And then they take very innocent, noble, in my view, patriotic sentiments. Why shouldn't you love Hungary? Why shouldn't you tear up when the national anthem is sung? Why shouldn't you feel deep emotion when the national poetry of Hungary is recited? Why shouldn't you feel a passionate feeling when Bartók and Kodály are played? And all of that is confiscated by these regimes and reproduced as being the basis of loyalty. And this nationalism resonates, of course, because globalization appears to threaten small national identities like Hungary and possibly larger national identities like Poland. So, exit. If you don't like it, you can leave. And the European Schengen system is a tremendous stabilizer of these regimes. 500,000 Hungarians are living outside the country. And a lot of the future, the political future of Hungary, depends on whether these people stay there permanently or come back home and drive domestic political changes or not. And we don't know the answer to that question. The other element in which Europe is essentially collusive, unwillingly collusive, in the stabilization of these regimes is obviously structural subsidy. And I live in a permanent fantasy, if you're in my job running the CEU. I have a fantasy phone call. The fantasy phone call goes like this. Angela Merkel picks up the phone and she says, Victor, I'm writing the 2028 budget with my friend Mr. Macron, and I see $4 billion on this sheet here, on this Excel spreadsheet. And Victor, it's a problem. It's a problem for me domestically, politically, because it's basically comes out of German taxpayers. And just as a politician to politician, that's a problem. Now, Victor, I got about 3 or 4 little things I'd like you to do for me by Monday morning. Because if you don't do it by Monday morning, it's not going to be 4, Victor. It's going to be 2. It might even be 1. So have a nice weekend, Victor. Talk to you Monday morning. Now, that is how politics, in our happy university eries, we think that's how politics ought to. Occasionally we love the idea of Machtpolitik. Let me tell you, it's never going to happen. The conversation will not occur. It's not going to occur in Poland either. This is the reality of European politics. I love Europe, I'm fond of it, I made my life here, I'm committed to it, blah, blah, blah. But the Machtpolitik required to stop this collusive bargain between liberal democracy and single-party states, the Machtpolitik necessary to stop it isn't on the table. Why? Because Merkel fears for her life from the same constitutional right and unconstitutional right stuff in her domestic political situation. She can't afford to go after the standard bearer of Christian democracy in Europe. That's where we are, folks. So, you can tell I'm a little steamed up. Normal service is now resumed, and we will proceed to a conclusion. I mean, I just think Europe is a structure of excuses and a structure of collusion. And it's important, particularly for the younger generation, to wake up for that. It does us no good to keep prating on about Europe. We don't understand the real politics and the collusive bargains that are sustaining what is an increasing phenomenon of single-party authoritarianism in Europe. And so we have an unexpected paradox. Openness, the openness of Hungary, the openness of Poland, is the condition of regime stability for the single-party state. And European membership provides the resources for single-party state consolidation. And so a Europe premised on the ideal of an open society and open borders has become collusive in its opposite, the consolidation of a single-party state. And not just in Europe, but beyond. I've mentioned in passing, well, Russia and China. And so, let me come to a conclusion here. To return to my framing questions, why is a conservative counter-revolution occurring in Europe? Because liberal constitutional elites failed to protect populations from three developments: global terrorism, economic collapse, and migration that appeared to threaten the national sovereignty and national identity of states. The second question was, are the new single-party states stable? They're stable precisely because they're open. You can exit, you have voice, and your loyalty is to the nation, not to the regime. And they're stable because Europe has turned excuses into a system of collusion. So what are the implications? I think European institutions lack the domestic legitimacy inside nation states to impose political costs on these regimes. I'm not looking to Europe to rescue CEU, and I'm not looking to Europe to save the rule of law in Poland. I'm looking to Poles to save the rule of law in Poland, and I'm looking to Hungarians to save the rule of law in Hungary. That's how it works. Domestic political drivers are either going to dig this thing out of the ditch or not. External blah, blah, blah is not going to do it. Hungarians and Poles and other countries threatened with single-party states will have to decide, is this the future I want to leave to my children, yes or no? And then get out on rainy Thursday nights and go to meetings where nobody shows up until suddenly people do start to show up. And then that's how politics is done. It's very basic. You got to show up. And until the opposition shows up, nothing's going to happen. So, if I go back now from high emotion to, some kind of loftier conclusion, and I readdress the question of the stability of these single-party states in their long historical competition with liberal democracy, there is one further thing to say. I don't want to overstate it because I don't want to come back to a kind of happy talk about the inevitable triumph of freedom. But I do think there are reasons to not exaggerate the indefinite stability of the authoritarian regimes that have emerged since 1989. Because they all, I mean Russia, I mean China, I mean Hungary, I mean Poland, I mean Turkey, I mean anywhere where it happens, they have a fundamental structural contradiction which I think we can all feel in our bones, which is reconciling the openness necessary for innovation and control. Reconcile the openness necessary for innovation and growth with single-party control. These regimes can be successful for a long time provided they deliver rising real incomes to sufficiently large numbers of their empowered national bourgeoisie to reproduce themselves. And they do so by successful imitation and collusion with and dependence upon free societies. But if you look at Hungary, it is a question, just Hungary, how can you deliver rising real incomes if you're bleeding population, if you're stifling innovation? I mean, yesterday on Friday, the government just cut the budget of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and diverted it entirely to the political control of a minister. Just in parenthesis, remember that the Hungarian Academy of Sciences was founded in the 1840s. It is one of the great institutions of European learning, and this regime has just cut it off at the knees. Now, is that a recipe for innovation, dynamism, and growth in the economy in 10 to 15 years? I don't think so. If you stifle innovation and if you create a rent-seeking rather than an entrepreneurial elite, what kind of future are you creating? Open societies, liberal constitutional orders have a considerable advantage. It's not exactly democracy itself, because democracy is often, because liberal constitutionalism is a checks and balances system which is so extremely good at making it impossible to do anything. Let me tell you about Canada. We've spent 40 years trying to get a railway between Windsor and Montreal. The Chinese did it in 18 months, right? I mean, so let's not overpraise democracy. It can be a mutually empowering veto system. But it has an epistemological property, which I want to emphasize. And this gets me back to where I started with Popper. The great thing about Popper is that it makes you think about the epistemology of democracy. If you have free scientific institutions, if you have independent peer review, if you have independent judiciary, if you have a free media, if you have a vibrant social media sphere, you have a babble of contending pluralist debate in which we try and ask together one simple question: what is true, what is real, right? And out of that babble, that contention, which is institutionally anchored in liberal constitutionalism, the dynamism, the surging dynamism of open societies is created. And that epistemological quality of liberal constitutionalism needs emphasis, because we're constantly being told It's a veto system that checks forward movement. The authoritarians are constantly telling us, you guys can't decide anything, put power in the hands of single people. The fatal weakness of authoritarianism is epistemological. The blindness, the arrogance, the closure that results. Our systems, for all their weakness, have an epistemological premise that seems precious, important, and valuable, and which we're exercising at this very moment. And so in the short run, and by short run, perhaps as long as yours truly is extant, the authoritarian turn might well prevail. I don't predict its overthrow anytime soon. But these regimes privilege their survival over the free creation and circulation of knowledge. And in so doing, they privilege control over innovation. And this, you might argue, is the long-term path to stagnation and entropy. And so in the long run, though longer perhaps than the lifetime of some of us in this room, we have reason to keep faith in democratic constitutional regimes because they depend on the free knowledge and free inquiry that this kind of discussion makes possible. Thank you for your attention.